Okay, let's get started. We're 1 minute ahead of time. I'm not going to say that's the German in me, but I'm very happy because that gives us a little more time for discussion. Great that you're all here. There's lots of competing sessions, many exciting ones that I would actually love to go to, but yeah, thanks for coming here. My name is Susanne Schmeier. I'm a professor in water law, cooperation and diplomacy at IHE Delft in the Netherlands, and I have the pleasure of moderating this exciting panel here. It's the only one focusing on water at this conference. It's one out of only two that focus on climate, environment, and water in the broader sense, which, yeah, maybe I find a little bit disappointing because I guess you're here because you're all aware of the climate, environment, water, and security nexus, which is playing an increasingly important role in nowadays security world. In the past, we used to refer to it as non-traditional security, but it's becoming actually quite traditional when we think about security threats. So again, great that you're here. Welcome. I have my distinguished panel on both sides of me here that I'll introduce in a moment. But just to say a few words about the session that Tanja Miškova from the Slovenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Slovenian Ambassador at Large for Water, and I have designed together. The idea behind this session was that we wanted to invite the security sector to think about water, environment, climate, and how to engage. Because you're all aware that water and climate are an increasing security threat, and you're probably also aware of the fact that there are increasing calls for the security sector to engage. The security sector should be aware of water conflicts, should engage in water conflicts. But when we take a closer look, it's actually not quite clear what the security sector is doing, what it should be doing and when, and what it maybe should not be doing, and at times when it should maybe not get involved. Think about securitization of water resources and so on. So what do we want to explore in this session today with a very interesting group of both water, climate and security experts is the question, when and how can the security sector know that they should engage, and how can they engage most effectively, especially in cooperation with other sectors and other actors. Might that be diplomacy, development, disaster, and others. And in order to discuss that, I have, as I said, this esteemed panel here. I'm going to start with introductions on this side. We have Swathi Veeravalli, who is the former Director of Climate Security and Adaptation at the National Security Council of the US. We have Alexandra Fong, the Chief for Policy and Guidance at the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, UNDPPA for short. We have Godard Busingye. He is many things, among others a professor in public international law at the Kampala International University, but also a retired general at the Uganda's People's Defense Force. So again, comes with a very interesting and very much on-the-ground security perspective. Then we have on this side here Florian Krampe. He is the Director of Studies, Peace and Development at CIPRI in Stockholm. And then here to my very left, we have Maia Baldauf. She's a humanitarian aid and development expert and practitioner, and currently a consultant at the Center for Operational Analysis and Research. So as you can see, it's a quite a big variety in terms of backgrounds, expertise from hard security to more the humanitarian side. So I'm pretty sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. But before we dive into the discussion and also move to your questions, and I see there's more people coming in, which is really great. So any questions you might have later, write them down, keep them in your mind. There will be plenty of opportunity in the next hour or so to ask them. But before we jump into that discussion, I'm going to start asking every panelist for a very, very short introductory remark, your main thoughts on what the security sector should do or maybe not do in this water, climate and security nexus. And we'll start with you, Swathi.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I have to bend a little awkwardly, but I think that's fine if you can hear me. So I want to start with addressing a common misperception. I used to work for the U.S. government and the U.S. Department of Defense, and it was often perceived that water was a local development issue, and it is in fact not. It is a geostrategic issue, and that's what we're here to discuss today. for nearly 2 decades, I think, we've talked about climate change as well as water as crisis multipliers, threat multipliers. This is a phrase that former Secretary General of the of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has said before. And if that's true, which I believe it to be true, then water is at its cutting edge, at the decisive edge. You'll hear from my panelists and in conversations with you all today how water can indeed fuel tension. It can also, it provides an opportunity for adversaries to exploit influence in certain areas. River disputes can lead to heightened tensions in cross-border areas. And there's a lot of empirical evidence, and again, we'll discuss that today with you all. But I think, for me, when I think about all of those things, water is everything and almost nothing at the same time. So my definition of water security is that you have to have sufficient quantity, quality of water with sufficient availability and accessibility. Okay, so if that's, we talk about a crisis multiplier, I think you get stuck in a defensive loop, in a cycle of always reacting, never preparing or responding. So what I'd like to do is propose it. We change the conversation a little bit and talk about water as a resilience multiplier, because certainly at the state level, there's empirical evidence. Susanne has done this herself, demonstrating how cooperation over water leads to heightened trust between states. At the community level, if we indeed have water security, then communities can thrive, not survive. And certainly for the military, if they invest in resilience and critical infrastructure enabling that resilience, then they enable their own operational readiness. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Swathi. We'll continue with you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Susanne. I love this idea of water as a resilience multiplier. I mean, water is a human right. It has cultural and spiritual value for almost all religions. It also, of course, has economic value through its use in agriculture, in industry, in hydropower. Water, unlike other resources, is not fixed in space and time. It flows horizontally across boundaries and borders, and it flows vertically from the sky to the ground. And we know that conflicts over water often arise out of the division of water between these various uses and users and across space and time. So quantity and accessibility, as Swathi said. And yes, the risks of water conflict have grown with the climate crisis, which is in part, some say in essence, a water crisis. And we have to and we can do more to mitigate those risks. But inversely, water cooperation is also widespread, and I would argue more widespread still than conflict today. Water cooperation has linked communities and societies for hundreds of years. It can build trust in other sectors also. It's hard to do, but it's doable, and we have to invest in the cooperation.
Thanks, Alexandra. We'll continue with you, Godard.
Thank you, moderator. Yeah, I will associate myself with the already comments that are on the floor, but also add that from the security perspective, I'm just 1 year out of the military, and my role was legal advisory from the lowest level up to the highest, because by the time I retired, I had served 5 years as the Chief of Legal Services in the Uganda People's Defense Forces, and I noted a number of things. That military life is scenario-based. We train from the word go when one joins the military. And when I say scenario-based, we train to understand the major sources of conflicts that we may be involved in, and so also train to avert conflicts. Water resources are part and parcel of our life. It's life. So we train, we do resource mapping during our training, doing the planning scenarios, and our main preoccupation has always been to avert conflicts, because when there's conflict, we die as the military. So you learn that the conflicts we are talking about are different levels: social conflicts, economic conflicts, and political conflicts, but we don't want to go to the armed conflicts stages as the military, because that's where we perish. Unfortunately, our political elite foment those conflicts, and the military get involved. So what we preoccupy ourselves is to train as much as possible ourselves to have the ability to avert conflicts. We do military diplomacy. If you hear defense advisors in different countries, they get information from the neighboring countries, from other countries about the resources that are available and what we can do. So basically, my intervention will be on how we try to avert conflicts based on our military training experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Godard. I think that's hinting at a lot of interesting questions that we'll get to later already, right? If it's all about preventing conflict, what's the security sector's role? We'll get to that, but Florian, over to you first.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and fully agree with quite a lot of the things that were said already. I want to raise two things, and the first one is maybe a slight spin on your question. It's not what the security sector should do, it's what the security sector inevitably will have to do. And I think especially around disaster risk response, we already see that today, that in flooding within Europe, the security sector is one of the first responders, and that is the case. If you look at South and Southeast Asia, that's pretty much 50% of what the military does, is disaster response. So there will be an increasing role potentially for the military sector in this regard, and that is something we need to acknowledge and come to terms with. And as a German, that is a political sensitive issue, because military inside the country is always weird. Which brings me to the second point, and that is an important recognition that that water is always a deeply political issue. And we sometimes, especially in the water sector, try to make it very technical. And that is a good thing, because it can calm down things. But underlying, especially when we look at fragile and conflict-affected states and the water sector within them, it's a political issue. And I think that is something we have to acknowledge, and that is something that the security sector has to acknowledge in the risk assessment, foresight, planning, etc. Just take the case of Kosovo, and you see that the water sector in Mitrovica is a microcosm of the larger conflict between Serbs and Kosovo Albanians in the city of Mitrovica. It's important to acknowledge that. Then we can move to a technical solution, but it's important to acknowledge that at the base there are political issues.
Thanks. And Maia.
Thank you very much.
I think you need to switch.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful for my panelists, or the co-panelists, setting up very nicely for what I have to say, and I very much agree with everything that's been said. I'll give an example from my work in Somalia, and I'll actually I'll give a positive example, because I feel that the rest of what I may say may bring down the mood a bit. So I'll go back to 2017, when Somalia was experiencing severe drought, and this, of course, triggered mass displacement internally or across the country, and particularly in cities where these internally displaced sites, many of them informal, as many as 2,000 sites across the country, just became overwhelmed. And so humanitarian services, such as water provision and sanitation, also became stretched and overwhelmed. And this, of course, can cause tensions sort of at the very micro level, in terms of queuing up and people just being stressed in the environment that they're living in. And then it also created an opportunity for insurgent groups or bad actors to exploit those grievances. So one component of the humanitarian architecture is a sector called camp management and camp coordination. Actually, it's the other way around, CCCM. It's one of the worst acronyms that we have, but I have spent a lot of time working in that sector. And there are three core activities that I think really, in a very practical way, respond to some of the things that we've spoken about at the very local level. So CCCM will do mapping of different services across different camps to ensure that there's coverage, or identify where there are gaps in coverage. And we'll also do assessments more deeply at the individual site level to identify any access constraints, any shortages, and then if there are any tensions, and then even more so to reinforce this idea of being sensitive to potential conflict, is we establish these camp committees, including specific sectoral committees. So we'll have a water committee, and then within that committee framework, we have a complaint and feedback mechanism. So individuals in the camp can already express their grievances this way. So it's one positive step we're taking.
Thanks a lot for these introductory remarks. I think we got a good idea already what's on people's mind, what their background is. I think we've heard a lot of interesting things, but I'm still missing, and I'll push you a little bit on that, an answer to our question, what the role of the security sector is. I think we've heard some hints, okay, there might be illicit terrorist actors using the opportunity if there are water crises. We've heard from Godard the whole issue about political decision making, but that's again about the political level, which then the security sector has to deal with. So I'd like to sort of drill a little deeper and come back to you, Swathi, as my first question. If indeed we assume that water is more and more on the agenda of the security sector, what exactly do you think the role should be, or what should it not be?
Okay, thanks. No, I'm glad you're drilling down that question. Now it's on. Okay, thanks. There's three things that I think the role of the security sector should take or do, and two things that I think they should not do. And I think, purely from a strategic perspective, right? So we're talking about at the macroeconomic, big scale, country to country level. The first one is anticipating hotspots. And Florian talked about using foresight analysis, and it was a point that echoed by General Busingye, integrating water stress into early warning systems. And making sure that that is available for the military decision maker or security planner, whoever the end user is, anticipating where water scarcity or water security can affect migration patterns, for example, or state fragility, more importantly. The second one is to support or enable governance in those specific regions. So can the security sector and the military and or defense partners enable and support river basin organizations, right? I know that sounds crazy, but in the US we have the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a great example of civil-military cooperation, and perhaps we could use something here to buttress river basin organizations in contested areas. Former Secretary of Defense Jim Mathis, once said that if you fund the State Department, which is our Foreign Affairs Department, fully, then you don't need to fund the military. You don't need to invest in guns as much. And so I think that premise really holds to be true here, indicating that there's a cost-benefit ratio of if you invest in stability, then you don't need to invest in conflict, which is a point that another point that General Busingye made. The third point that security partners and or defense planners can utilize from a strategic perspective is really how can they lift up water in security partnerships. NATO is starting to do this on climate, for example, right? And I talked about General Stauffenberger earlier, who's really lifting up how climate is going to affect how the security sector does military planning, right? How soldiers do their training. But can we talk about how water is going to affect training, for example? And we can come back to that point in conversations. And then from a tactical and operational perspective, I think that's a slightly different conversation, but we really need to ensure how knowledge of the military and the security sectors need to know how the lack of water access is going to result in operational and tactical failures at those levels. Okay, two things really quickly on what the sector should not do. One is treat water purely as technical, right? And that was a point that Florian made earlier. Governance, trust, equity are all part of water and water security. Secondly, the security sector should not ignore the maintenance and institutions. So obviously, investing in infrastructure that is climate proof would be fantastic and in different scales. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Swathi. I think these were a lot of interesting elements. One of them that I find particularly interesting is that whole question of military and basin organizations cooperating with. You mentioned the example of the Corps of Engineers, which is certainly one that's quite known and has been spreading around the world as well, with the Corps exchanging with other basin organizations. But then I'm also thinking about the Lake Chad Basin Commission and the Multinational Joint Task Force to fight Boko Haram, which was basically put into the Lake Chad Basin Organization, which guess the verdict's still out to what extent that worked, but I can tell you it didn't work particularly well when it comes to then strengthening the organization's water management capacities. So I think one of many interesting elements that you mentioned. But let's drill into the UN specifically, and especially the UN's field missions, the UN's engagements in different countries, different regions. What's your take on this, Alexandra?
Thanks, Susanne. So most UN peace operations today are deployed in countries that are conflict affected, but also highly vulnerable to climate change. And climate change impacts are felt, again, primarily through water, whether it's a question of too much water or too little water. And again, we know that these risks don't automatically lead to conflict, but in many places they are acting as risk multipliers. And so that's where the risk mitigation action comes in. And at the same time, frankly, we're seeing more opportunities for peace building, climate action, water management, including the involvement of women in water management at the local level, to really reinforce each other. And when you get this cooperation right, you get co-benefits that spill into other actions. So yes, we cannot ignore the risks, but we also cannot afford to ignore the opportunities around this. So the UN is engaging, our missions are engaging in West Africa, in the Sahel, in Somalia, in the Horn, and elsewhere. The question of whether has been settled, whether we should, but the question of how remains a challenge, because we have learned this work requires us to work at the global, regional, national, all the way down to the community level. It requires us to marry political and technical approaches. And like water itself, the cooperation has to flow across boundaries, across agencies, across disciplines, across countries, and that's a huge challenge for us. But I wanted to give one example quickly, if I may, Susanne, which is around the work in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan has very underdeveloped water governance mechanisms due to years of instability and conflict, and is at the same time extremely vulnerable to climate change. Again, mostly felt through the impact on water. So the Afghan people today are experiencing an increasingly unpredictable water cycle of droughts and floods. Today, half of Afghanistan's provinces are in severe drought. And this, of course, leads to humanitarian need. It leads to a loss of livelihood. It cripples the economy. Over 2/3 of Afghans get their livelihoods from agriculture. So you can imagine. And our mission, UNAMA, in Afghanistan is working using the UN's convening and facilitation role, engaging technically with the de facto authorities and with communities all across the country on water cooperation. So at the community level, very concretely, just last week, the mission organized a consultation with community elders whose villages had been displaced by drought across 5 southern provinces in Afghanistan. And listening to those communities really gives you a more granular understanding of what's happening. How is social cohesion impacted? How are communities welcoming displaced people? What are the water management mechanisms at the community level, which up to now have worked very well, but now are under such stress from this drought that they risk collapsing, which could lead to conflict over irrigation water? And most importantly, again, how can we listen out to local solutions that could be supported and scaled, not to reinvent the wheel? So this is kind of the work, what the work looks like at the local level. And then conversely, at the national level, our mission co-chairs with the World Bank something called the Afghanistan Water Platform, which has various working groups. I won't go into them here, but they deal with issues such as irrigation, water resource management, and even crucially, transboundary waters. So these is just to illustrate a little bit the different levels at which we're trying to work. Afghanistan is a very specific context. The work will look very different in the Sahel, or indeed, I don't know, in the Pacific. But we do see emerging a body of practice around adaptive water cooperation, even in the era of climate change.
Thanks, and thanks for ending with cooperation. I nonetheless want to go back a little bit to conflict for now, because you've both mentioned implicitly, explicitly, that the starting point for the security sector to engage is the risk, or actually the fact that it's happening, that water can be either at the origin of a conflict or can be a threat multiplier in sort of a bigger context where water then is the last, literally, drop that makes the bucket spill over. So I want to turn to you, General, and see from your experience in Uganda, but also beyond that, what's your experience? How does water contribute to the escalation of conflict, or actually is at the origin of conflict?
Thank you. I want to start by giving my opinion, and based on my experience, about how the military has tried to avert the escalation of conflict based on water resources. from the Ugandan perspective, Uganda is a country which is naturally endowed with a lot of water resources, lakes, rivers. We have Lake Victoria, which is shared by Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. I think the biggest lake on the continent, the second in the world, I understand. We have River Nile, which transits from the basin lakes. We have a conflict on where it starts from. Uganda says it starts from Uganda. Kenya says it starts from Kenya. Rwanda says from Rwanda. DRC from DRC, but ends up here in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this is an example. Those two examples. We also have other transboundary water resources, like between Uganda and DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. And what do we do as the military and our political leaderships? We have integrated the military into the other organs of governance in the region, in the African continent. We take water from being a sovereign natural resource to a regional and continental natural resource. We have taken to multilateralism in terms of water governance. At all stages, the military is involved. I'll give an example. We have a community known as East African Community. I think now we are 10 member states. And we have sectoral councils. We have a sectoral council on water and natural resources, but we also have a sectoral council on defense and security. We meet, and our decisions, our discussions end up in the summit of the community. We have IGAD, Intergovernmental Development Organization. We have East African Standby Force, and we have the African Union, where we have got a specialized defense technical committee. All we discuss is about averting conflict, because conflict is natural. We are talking about a resource that is competed for in terms of use, accessibility and use. So how do we ensure that we don't escalate conflict based on that? We have our intelligence feelers on the ground through civil-military relations at all levels. If, for example, a neighboring country is trying to weaponize the water resource to assert interests and call for interest on the water resource, we use diplomacy. We discuss. We have bilateral committees. We have defense liaison officers across the borders. These points talk to each other regularly so that we don't have serious escalation of the conflicts. But of course, there will be resource use conflicts which I think cannot be avoided. I'll give examples. The first example is the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. I participated from my other perspective in the development of some of the instruments for the Nile Basin Initiative. Ethiopians are convinced that the construction of the dam does not have adverse effects on how much water will go to Sudan and Egypt ultimately. And I think Egypt and Sudan also have, because they participate in the meetings, they also know that. But there is also egoism in terms of resource ownership. There is also colonial history. Because, for example, we have the Nile Basin Agreements of 1928 and 1929, which gave Egypt a lot of interest in the waters of River Nile. We can't do anything at the source. I come from Uganda. The source of the Nile is in Uganda. At the source of River Nile in Jinja, without Egyptian knowing. But what have we done? We have allowed the Egyptian government to have its defense engineers who monitor what we do with the River Nile and these other waters that feed into on a day-to-day basis. We cooperate with them. So in a nutshell, if we don't involve the military into the governance structures of the whole society, we end up weaponizing water resources. We know that there are other aspects that have come in. Climate change, of course, is very critical now as we talk. You see that because of climate change, resource constraints, refugee crisis, and all other aspects which have come on board must be understood by the military. If we don't, you'll say, let's, as a conclusion, let's give a scenario of alienating the military from the governance structures of the society. And you see a refugee influx. We have I think on the continent of African continent, we have the largest refugee influx from the neighborhood, from DRC, from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, and other neighboring countries. We would treat the refugees as alien persons. We would mistreat them. We would stop them from coming. But you know they are coming from some adverse conditions to their livelihood. So we participate in the refugee screening and settlement. We participate in disaster management programs. Overall, I'm convinced that the African continent has established good mechanisms for ensuring that the competitiveness on use of water resources does not escalate into an armed conflict scenario. That is my submission.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Turning to you, Florian, as a scientist, I think it's a good point in our conversation to disentangle things a little bit and look at what the science has to say. So we heard, yes, water can be a source of conflict, can be a threat multiplier. We also heard that there are a lot of sort of linked issues, migration, displacement, and so on. But we've also heard that there's a lot of cooperation. So what does the science actually say? What's the risk of water conflict? And maybe what is conflict and how should we understand conflict?
Going for the big question. I think, I mean, the answer is yes. It's what the science and the research in this field shows us is that all of that is true. And that's really annoying for anyone who is working in a political and space of having to do something because, so what is it? What do I do? Do I solve conflict or is it automatic, right? So what we know is that water issues as well as climate issues increase the risk of conflict. That is a fact. But that's not a deterministic relationship. That doesn't mean that everywhere the same climate or water-related impacts or events will result in a conflict. Context matters. The political system and all that economic, social dynamics on the local level, on the national level, everything matters. Again, really annoying because we want predictability, but what I can give you is complexity and uncertainty. But within that, we see actually a lot of structure, not in the deterministic causal mechanism way of A leads to B, but in a way where we see pathways. And I want you to understand pathways in this context more as a highway that goes from A to B, but how exactly and how fast is not determined. There's options, right? And it's a tool to think about that. What we have identified in our work, especially on climate, is livelihood deterioration is one of the key factors that if you have people's vulnerability that is impacted by climate change, livelihood deterioration is one of the factors that increases the risk of conflict. Migration and mobility impacts, displacement, a key factor, again, making it really annoying because it doesn't mean now and doesn't mean in the location where stuff happened, but might be next year in a different location where people have been displaced to. Tactical considerations. Armed actors are using water events like floods as an opportunity. We see that in Mali or Somalia, where actually we have an asymmetry between more formal military actors and the more insurgent actors, which are much more agile in some of these environments and can navigate that and use it as a tactical opportunity. And elite exploitation, elites are just capitalizing on the state that is there. So that is a fact that we know. And the second side is that that's not a deterministic relationship, but we have a choice. And that's where the cooperation element comes in. Like if we just wait and don't do anything, the risk of conflict is high. But we have entry points, and those entry points require military actors. I mean, in the past, we have always preached that the human security risks of today are the hard security risks of tomorrow, but there are no hard security solutions. And there are no hard security solutions. You're not going to fight the issue with the military, but there are roles for the military, and I think that is, as a security sector, we need to pay attention to. Yeah.
Thanks. I think from the answers so far, we've established that yes, there is a role for the security sector to play, and we'll, in a moment, in the next part of our panel, get into how to actually do that, which tools do we need, which foresight is needed. But I want to take a little detour and ask you a question with the hope for a very honest response coming from the humanitarian perspective. Having experience in regions where there is both humanitarian action, but also military, but also armed illicit groups engagement, what's your feeling about the engagement of the security sector? Do you think that's helpful, getting the security sector in increasingly, or are there also risks?
Yes. So from my perspective, working in the humanitarian sector, I have seen how our humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence can be compromised when security considerations take precedence over humanitarian needs. So my instinct is to be vigilant about the increasing cooperation between the security sector and water from the humanitarian perspective. And I think that just right off the bat, this cooperation needs to be deeply assessed and well contextualized to even just start having that discussion of engagement. And I'll give some more concrete recommendations as we continue, but I'll start with an example from one paper that I collaborated with another IHE Delft scholar, Musa Adaklan. So it's one of my small forays into research as a practitioner. And we found in studying Yemen as a context in which a lot of these factors intersect and exacerbate each other, that in studying mainly agriculture projects, we found that international aid organizations, including the UN, NGOs, et cetera, as well as also the government, they were starting to incorporate environmental considerations into their agriculture planning and implementation, which was great. But we found that there was not evidence to show that there was an adequate assessment of tensions and conflicts around water and natural resources. And we conducted a survey across 14 governorates of Yemen, and only 22% of respondents said that they felt that those conflict issues were assessed thoroughly. And so in our recommendations, of course, to development actors, we've said, assess thoroughly, but then specifically to sort of security or conflict negotiation actors, we wanted them to focus on one thing, which was to integrate environmental justice into peace building. While avoiding narratives around environmental conflicts being deterministic, and that has been repeated several times. And so I think we can say that that's a strong recommendation. But of course, recommendations like this are straightforward, except I've found that they can fall flat in the context of some of the toughest conflict-affected places. So I'll give another example from Yemen when I was back in my normal role as a practitioner. So I was overseeing emergency food distribution and CCCM, so that's the camp the activities. And I spent most of my time trying to secure travel permits for our local team to just move from one place to another. These were all Yemenis. They lived in the area. But these bureaucratic barriers were delaying many times and oftentimes halting our operations entirely at a time when half of the population was severely food insecure, and the IPC had assessed that there were about 16,000 people in IPC 5. We're all familiar with this, I think, now. So these are famine-like conditions, and yet still we were prevented from providing food. And so coming back to the water issue, even if we wanted to do water trucking, which is what we were doing in the camps, in the most conflict-sensitive way, making sure that our technical assessments around the sources ensured that we weren't depleting the water table. Even if we wanted to do things in the most recommended way, we simply couldn't. So as we think about water and environmental issues contributing to conflict that then leads to or contributes to protracted humanitarian crises, we really must interrogate at multiple levels this increased involvement of the security sector. And I'll deviate quite quickly because I have seen positive involvement of the security sector personally from two examples as well. During the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, we had a good cooperation with the U.S. military. There are many examples of that. And then also after Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the military, multiple militaries played a really positive role in helping to respond. But those are examples of not conflict related disasters, at least at the time of those disasters. So in conflict settings where access to water is probably already an exacerbating factor or a contentious issue, this engagement between security, environment, and humanitarian, as I said, must be really assessed well and structured as much as possible. Otherwise, we risk these cycles of restrictions on aid operations, and then suffering is increased, and that heightens grievances, and that can be weaponized, as we've discussed. And at the same time, this is happening where natural resources are going to be impacted by climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll come back to this point. Humanitarianism itself is being weakened and eroded. So I will give some concrete suggestions for helpful engagement in specifically conflict situations, but I just wanted to open with that.
Thank you. I think that's a nice segue into the second part of the session, where we want to explore what does the security sector actually need to engage? What type of information do you need? What foresight do you need? What tools do you need? But also how to engage with the humanitarian, but also the disaster, the development, the diplomacy sector. But before I go into questions to the panelists, I just want to check in the room quickly whether there are any urgent burning questions from the audience already. We'd be happy to take them. Yeah, I see one. We have a microphone. It's going to come to you in a second. And maybe we take one or two questions now and then combine them with the next round of questions. Here, the gentleman in the front, please.
Thank you very much. Testing, testing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the opening remarks and the details that you have already provided. I was just wondering, most of the topics have been covered is in the developing world. However, there are very clear examples that the developed world is not immune to utilizing water as a geopolitical or even directly strategic resource to put pressure, be it political or otherwise. Let's say the Three Gorges Dam, or also extreme water scarcity in the Baikal Lake because it was used so intensely for industry, for cotton and other uses, which has absolutely devastated the area. Will this in some fashion be covered, or alternatively, could the approaches that you are so experienced in be utilized in the developed world? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another? Yes, here also in the front, if you can just pass it through.
Thank you. I think my question is going to build on what he sort of touched on, which is I think we looked at it from different perspectives, government, military, humanitarian perspective, science. But I think obviously the big sort of elephant in the room is private sector, which seeks to, when there's scarcity, there's profit. And obviously private sector companies have been making the case as far as water is not a human right, all the way to some more mild, more palatable sort of still inhumane solutions about water. And I think, I grapple with this because I'm a little bit afraid. I'm from the Balkans, and we have water, but where there is an abundance, there's also opportunities for profit. And my concrete question is: do you think we have across the globe, we have the legislative mechanisms to protect water? Are we thinking in the right way about ensuring that we're using it sustainably, that we'll be able to maintain the populations that we have, that we're going to be able to continue to do economic development the way that we are in, by 2050, what was it? I think 40% of the world's freshwater springs will disappear. So obviously that will change the game completely. Are we in a position from a legislative and a policy standpoint to sort of deal with that at this juncture? Thank you.
Thank you. Two interesting questions that slightly divert us, but I will see to what extent we can build them in. I think, for example, taking lessons learned from various parts around the world into the developed world, but also the other way around is, I think, something that maybe, Swathi, you want to touch on later with the Corps of Engineers work. We'll try to build it in, but I was also asked by the organizers to very much stick to the topic, so we'll see how we can diplomatically manage the two. But I think these are very important questions because they touch very much at the origin, right? In this session, we're very much focusing on what we should do once there is conflict around water, but you both have actually touched on something that goes much deeper, is where does that conflict actually come from? I'm not sure we have any private sector representatives in the room, and if we had, whether they wanted to reveal their identity right now. But if you are, please join the discussion. But I want to first go a little bit back into that whole question of what the security sector actually needs to address these problems. And I'm going to start with you, General. I'm going to start with you, Godard. If you look at your region and the work that you've done, is there any tools, any knowledge, information, foresight that you had or that you wish you had when you addressed conflicts around water?
Thank you. I would say that I've been fortunate to have a stint in the academia, and also, of course, for the last 39 years until last year, I was in the military. And I moved in the different levels. I participated in different regional bodies, meetings, and I noted a number of things. What does the military do, or the security sector broadly do, in terms of resource management broadly? The starting point for the military is that security sector is broader than the military, you are aware. We have the security organizations, those who do intelligence work for the governments, internal and external. But the military is a unique body that has a stint in all those things. We do have, maybe if I go to his question, in the case of Uganda, we have a parastatal belonging to the Ministry of Defense, the National Enterprise Corporation. It does private work. It is industries, water resource management, commercialization of water, bottling of water, and marketing it. So as we to get to understand what the commercial sector does and how does it do. So if you're extracting water and you're bottling it and you are selling it as a security sector, then you get to know why other people are doing it and how they are doing it and what they are not doing right. Then you can advise, because we have, and our country is interesting, we have even members of military members in parliament, 10 of them by the constitution. So we engage with the other organs of the government to ensure that we don't escalate conflicts based on the water resources. That's at the national level. Then regionally, we have tried to understand that water cannot be confined to territorial jurisdictions. It's a transboundary resource. So how do we do it? We have, with the help of development partners, engaged in joint military training exercises on the continent, several of them. So that all the militaries now, if we are going to have, for example, a military operation for 10 countries under the East African Standby Force, which is a component of the African Union, then we are able to understand these are the resources that we should be protecting. This is how we shall protect the people's interests regarding the water resources. So we do joint military trainings, programs. It's a bit of an expensive venture, but we think it is necessary and it is done. EU sponsors it, the United States government and other development partners, I'm aware. So we do things which, again, back to his question, I don't think that being a developed world and a third world or the developed world has any distinction in terms of how we manage the water resources. We can learn from each other. How do we do it best here, and what can we emulate the other side? Moreover, as I've said already, we do partner with members of the developed world. Maybe they are also learning how to protect their resources because they are observers when we are doing these military exercises. We have the civil military component where we have military observers from different areas who are interested in that. We do mission scenario-based training programs. She mentioned Somalia. Uganda has been in Somalia since 2007. Before we deploy our troops into missions abroad, we do pre-mission training for maybe sometimes over 1 year, training our soldiers on the cultural issues, where they are going, social issues, economic issues, environmental issues, and how generally to relate with the population where they will go. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then our missions will be unsuccessful. We also continuously do regular military trainings as the soldier upgrades in the levels. I started as a foot soldier, as a private soldier. I was a sergeant for 13 years. I don't know for what reason. But then eventually I became an officer later on, and I retired at a general rank. But I noted that at each term, when you advance in military levels, you advance in, there is an advanced dose that you get in terms of what surrounds you. As a leader, as a general, you know most of the geopolitics of the region, the global issues, the environmental issues, and the rest of it. And we inculcate them into our soldiers. I heard that he's from the Dutch embassy here. We have a cooperation with the Dutch Ministry of Defense of the Dutch government. I've been to The Hague, and we have training programs with the Dutch. We have a school in Uganda, the Legal Training Center for the military lawyers, which is a multiplier training college for people going to mission areas. We have mainstreamed training on IHR and human rights issues to all our soldiers from the time they join the forces, and it is replicated in most of our regional partner neighbors, because they come to our center and they train with us, and we also train with them. So the tools that we use, basically, the critical tool, which every soldier does, is resource mapping. The exercise that you do at a recruit level, the obstacles that you are going to get, for example, in the scenario, will be, say, water bodies. It will be how to deal with the communities in case there is a conflict and you must evacuate the communities from around the water resources. How do you do that? So we do resource mapping. A map, physical map, is a major tool that we have as soldiers when we are training. We know all that is surrounding us, who is our neighbor. We also try to get, as much as possible, the ideological orientation of our neighbors. What do they think about us? How do they think about these resources? What do they think that they can do and we can't do better? And we try to harmonize. We also have a very important tool, an early warning system or mechanism. That is a tool that developed both at the national level, sub-regional level, and continental level. We have those early warning systems on the continent, so that, and we, like the AU has got contacts with people on the ground in all countries. Understand, they even give phones, mobile phones. In case you detect something, you communicate to AU quarters or IGAD in Addis Ababa. But those early warning tools have helped us to detect anything that is disturbing the water resources, exploitation, and maybe, unfortunately, we have non-state actors who weaponize the water resources. How do we deal with them without denying the local populations of the access to the available water resources? So in conclusion, the security sector must be answerable to the local population. It must be answerable to the political elite, but also must be able to understand and be able to advise. And I think that is very critical, to advise the strategic, the political elite on how to deal with conflicts. If we don't do that, then you'll find that, I would say maybe that the word would be a blood bath. Because the militaries we are trained to kill. That is very important. But we are human beings. We don't kill for the sake of killing. And we avoid killing because we know we can also be killed. So the only way to do that is to understand the thin line between life and death, and then advise the political elite not to engage us into armed conflicts. Social conflicts come, we participate. I've already mentioned we have the border conflicts management system, the liaison officers and whatever. But to conclude, Chair, resource mapping is a very critical tool, and early warning systems, which lead to the conflict prevention and resolution mechanism tools as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll move on to Alexandra with the request for short answers to still have time for some questions. So if you want to indicate already if you have questions, just give me a sign. But turning to you, Alexandra, if you think about a truly proactive approach to this, what do you think is needed for the UN, or what would you wish you had?
So I'll come at it from the UN as a peace and security actor, with missions that have been mandated by the Security Council of the UN. So it's obviously not the military perspective, but it's this very specific. Is that
Yes,
what you,
indeed.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I mean, first of all, to implement the Paris Agreement would be my biggest wish, but more specifically, knowledge, because we on the peace and security side of the UN are not climate experts. We are not water experts. Our learning curve has been really steep on this. We have to fill the libraries, as you were saying. Knowledge is really emerging in this area in different parts of the world. Capture that. We have, to Florian's point, we've got the science. We know, unlike conflict, we actually have climate projections. We don't really have conflict projections, but we have climate projections and we have hydrological forecasts. So the science part we know, but we don't know how those trends are going to interact with these multiple other factors that can or cannot, as Florian was saying, cause conflict. So there's really no way around, no shortcut, I think, from that really granular analysis. And to get to that really granular analysis, is there really a shortcut? As you were saying, every soldier needs to understand the resource layout. Is there really a shortcut to robustly collecting data at the local level, identify water, climate, security hotspots, and then build an evidence base where to prioritize interventions, because we all have limited resources? Where are we going to intervene? That's what we need to know. We can't intervene everywhere. We can't support everything. But what are these priority interventions? You can only find that through this granular analysis. Second, we need to bring a prevention lens. So knowing what we know today, what do we have to put in place today to prevent water-related conflicts 5, 10, 15 years from now, when we know that projections are getting worse? And this means, yes, water-related indicators, early warning systems, factoring hydrological realities into preventive diplomacy and mediation efforts, using shared resource management as an entry point for dialogue, all these kind of things. Third, I really think this is important. We must invest in technical solutions, but also in political solutions, because decisions over water are fundamentally political. We have to be prepared to engage cleverly, politically, as well as on the technical side. And if we do it well, you can actually get to cooperation as opposed to just mitigation. And then fourth, it's the resources. It's always the resources. But in this case, not for the UN, although that would be nice too, but for conflict-affected countries who are at the moment almost entirely shut out from multilateral climate funds. We have to advocate for these countries. Of course, investing in them is risky, but not investing in them is an even greater risk. They have to be able to access funding for this vital adaptation work that we're talking about. And at the moment, there's just not enough of that.
Thanks. I think the last point you hinted at is actually quite important, right? If you look at the huge amount of climate funds that are out there, such a small share is going to the countries that actually need it most. So I think that's, I guess, a topic for yet another session, maybe next year. But another point that you brought up is that very specific question that we also started off. How do we know that water scarcity, too much water, too little water, too dirty water, actually leads not only to a conflict, but a conflict that becomes such a high-level security threat that the security sector takes an interest in it? And looking at you, Swathi, what do you think we need to know that and to take that decision?
I'll try and quickly answer this. So when I was at the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Marines came to us and they said, we're doing work in Afghanistan, agribusiness development teams. We understand that natural resources are hugely important to community stability. So tell us everything you can about water. Get us smart on water. And I said, okay, with our team. And we put together a framework, a smart water question framework. This was about 240 questions that we expected the U.S. Marines to go through in some village in Afghanistan. So you can imagine that they did not use this tool. But from an academic perspective, it was very robust. Okay, so flipping that on the other side, when I was working at AFRICOM, and I was now a military planner, I realized how ridiculous our proposal was. So I thought to myself, we needed really a tool to help indicate where stability could occur, right, for the military. And so if I was working for the U.S. government now, and I was a security planner, and what I would want is a water stability index that helps indicate where water is of geostrategic import. And this has to be adapted, obviously, and we talked a lot about that, context specific. But really quickly, those 5 indicators, for example, that could indicate how water is of geostrategic import and preventively creating stability. The first one would be, is water of, is there cross-border exposure here? Is there a major transboundary water under dispute? Secondly, is there migration pressure? Is water scarcity pushing displacement that could destabilize regions or enable migration flows? Thirdly, governance resilience. Is there a functioning river basin body or organization or other type of mechanism that could help provide that institutional adaptive capacity? Fourth, is there adversarial leverage? Are there rivals or competitors exploiting water projects for influence in those specific geostrategic landscapes? And then fifth, are there systemic impacts? Are water shortages or water security linked to food? And we know all of the cyclical relationships between food, energy, water, cybersecurity, health security, all of those things, are they there? And so in a perfect world, let's just say if 2 of those indicators flashed or 3 of those indicators flash red, then yes, here we have a potential geostrategic impact of water security in that region. That, I think, would be useful for military planners. Military planners plan for the next 1 to 5 years. We know that we have great hydrological forecasts. We know that we have great, some good climate forecasts, seasonal predictions at that models, but it's really getting those tools into the hand of the decision makers, which is what I think is the big gap for us right now. I'll pause there and maybe hand it back to you, Susanne.
Thanks. I think that was very interesting and also great that you had 5 and not 240 questions. But I think we all should. But I think what was interesting, and I'll give that in a moment to Florian, together with another question. I think what's interesting is that all the 5 questions you had did actually not point so much at the biophysical factors, but actually at the governance factors. And that's something we also know from all the research that's out there on water conflict. And Florian has hinted at that in his earlier answer. It's not so much about is there water, is there too dirty water, too little water, but it's about society's capacity to deal with these challenges. But that makes it more complex and probably leads to 240 questions. But I want to turn to you, Maia, first. I think we've come to a point where we have some sort of consensus. I'm not going to go into detail how strong that consensus is, but I think there's some sort of consensus that there is a need for all the different actors to work together. And I'm wondering if you could make a wish, assuming that that cooperation between the security sector, humanitarian sector, diplomacy is only going to grow in the future, what would be your wish on how to best do that and how to most effectively do that, also keeping humanitarianism in mind, which I think is very important that you pointed that out.
Thank you, Susanne. So I'll just maybe define, because I think there's an important clarification about security sector. So when I address this question, I'll speak about it in primarily the military, bearing in mind that it's a broad sector. So my wish or my hope is that that we see the security sector become more humanitarianized and not humanitarianism become more securitized itself. And this is especially important in conflicts. So even just to start out as a minimum, I would like the security sector to recognize the essential and irreplaceable role that the humanitarian sector plays, the professional humanitarian sector plays, and to respect the principles that humanitarians uphold in our work. Because and we've kind of touched on this, humanitarians and security forces are ultimately both about saving and protecting non-combatant life. We both provide services, we coordinate logistics, we conduct risk analyses, we do resource mapping, we love maps as well. But we don't use force, even as a last resort, of course. So that gives us credibility with communities and populations. As humanitarians, our obligation is to provide material and intangible support to people in need in line with our principles. And there will probably be increasing need for humanitarian response, unfortunately, as the world becomes more chaotic. And in conflict settings, security actors are obligated to adhere to, thank you for the mention, international humanitarian law. And alongside that, third states are obligated to hold actors accountable when they fail to comply with international humanitarian law, or IHL. So it's in this context of IHL that I would like to address this second question, and I'll start with a case study, a simple one from the West Bank. It's a joke. It's a very challenging context. I oversee research and analysis that is focused on the West Bank, and interestingly, I noticed the gentleman who was asking about the private sector has left, but I'll reference that briefly in a bit. And I want to talk about the impact of Israel's occupation on the water resources inside the West Bank. And I realize that this is an extreme example, but let's take it as a cautionary tale about two worrying dynamics that I would like to point out. So the first is competition over access to water and natural resources in the absence of adherence to IHL, and also the securitization of not just water access, but of humanitarian and development assistance itself. And I'll explain a bit how. So Palestine is one of the most water scarce places on earth in terms of per capita supply. Today, Israel controls 89% of Palestinian water resources in the West Bank, and it also creates these access restrictions, and specifically because it holds veto power in something called the Joint Water Committee, which was established as part of the Oslo Accords, and it's an agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military that oversees the West Bank, and they are responsible for issuing permits. And this Joint Water Committee rejects half of the water-related infrastructure permits that are submitted by Palestinians for construction. And even more shocking, 97% of all general construction permits are rejected, and this includes water storage infrastructure. If a piece of infrastructure is constructed by a Palestinian company, home, or individual, there's always a risk that it will be demolished. And this includes donor-funded infrastructure, including EU and EU member state-funded infrastructure. That no longer makes a difference. And so, following all of that, and I'll speak very briefly because we asked about the developed world and the private sector. In this context, Israel is the developed nation. It is the middle-income country in the Middle East. It is the beacon of democracy in some opinions and perspectives. And it's also the private sector that benefits from this exploitation of Palestinian water resources. So we can keep these things in mind as we look at things that are even the most complex. And finally, I'll say that sort of two points that I'd like to make. So firstly, for improved cooperation between the humanitarian and security sectors, and specifically conflict settings, and especially protracted, very complex ones like we will probably be dealing with and like many of us have, I would like to see real, meaningful adherence to IHL and real, serious consequences in terms of accountability for violations of IHL. And secondly, here are my three concrete things, because we also love lists. I would like security actors to have an increased understanding of IHL, and of course, as well as understanding the strategic place of humanitarianism and humanitarian principles. And I would like each sector, secondly, to prioritize diverse and marginalized local voices, not just local elite or powerful voices when it comes to analyses and research. And this is how you contextualize, not just copy-pasting and changing a few things. And then thirdly, I think that both sectors should promote and fund local knowledge, as has been referenced as well, and expertise in the studies and looking at local and system levels. And why should we do this? As a humanitarian, I think I can speak on behalf of the sector that we really fear this trend of the securitization of humanitarianism. We fear that it will worsen with the risks of environmental disaster and climate change, especially in conflicts. So even if security actors don't necessarily care about playing by the humanitarian playbook, they should care about worsening destabilization. And so we need genuine, reliable cooperation. And it cannot exist without basic conditions, that adherence to IHL, the accountability for violations, and ultimately this is my final point, political will.
Thanks, Maia.
May I?
We're actually running out of time, and I want to see if there's questions in the room before I turn to our last panelist. I know it's a very complex topic, an interesting topic, but I don't want to close us off before checking if there's any questions. Not the same person again. Sorry.
No other questions.
I struggle seeing everyone in the back there. No question for now. Well, we'll have time for discussions later, but I really want to also have a few minutes to turn to you, Florian, because it's actually not a few minutes, actually only 1 or 2 minutes, but no pressure. Because there have been a lot of calls for science from Maia just now, knowledge, local knowledge, but also everyone to my right here has really called for knowledge for science. What's your experience with that science policy dialogue in the field? And do you think there's actually, with all these calls for science, a real interest to take science up in decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our responsibility from the research side is producing research that is not out there and is like something where Tanya's like, what should I do with that? But that is accessible, is understandable, and proactively giving you the tools and the information you need. I think that is a challenge that we have on the research side. Not against academic research that is more complex, but my role as a research institute that is based in science but leaning towards policy is translation. How do I make this clear? I want to be very unpopular now, apparently, because when I took my notes before, I was like, well, what do we need and what do we not need? We need evidence-based decision-making. And my first point on what don't we need is another tool or map that puts a red dot on something, right? And just let me qualify that for a second. I think we have a tendency of creating the same tools again and again, and now the Germans starting a conflict, climate, vulnerability index. Great. But we have already a lot of tools. So I think before we start a new tool, let us at least check, is there existing tools that we can develop? And the examples from the Horn of Africa and the AU, I think, are excellent, right? Because there is early warning systems. There is a continental early warning system, a regional one. Can we develop those further and fund those instead of funding another one? So that's going also in the finance direction to like, let's put the money behind one thing really that works and develop that further. What we need on the evidence-based decision-making side is also continued assessments as part of that. And that is a thing that I've noticed over the last years from the policy side is like, well, we know the science, we need to move towards action. Yes, but I'm doing climate security risk assessments for Somalia now for a couple of years, and I can tell you that's different every year. So we cannot stop and be like, well, my 2022 assessment of Somalia says this, and we are acting in 25. Right? That doesn't fit. It makes no sense. So we need to have this continuous effort that needs accompaniment, that needs a close interaction from us. Like we are very privileged to work with Sasha and others together in the UN system for us to get the real needs, but also being able to tailor the knowledge then in a way and raise the right issues. But that is sort of where the research side needs to also start to accompany, and where we need to be honest and be like, so this went wrong. That's also another tendency we have. It's like we're looking at what went right, but actually maybe we need to learn what also went wrong just to draw the lessons and develop tools further.
Thank you. I think that was very interesting. In the last very few minutes we have, I want to give every panelist the chance for one last sentence, and maybe you want to bring yours in. But my question is actually going to be quite different. I want to know from you, coming out of this session today, which clearly was too short, what are you taking home with you that changed your perspective? What's different now than it was 1 hour, 15 minutes ago in your perception that you learned from the other panelists? And Maia, because you have one sentence ready anyway, I'm going to start with you. Microphone.
Thank you, Susanne. I think I've learned that we simply have a lot more in common, and actually even in preparing for this, simply, my engagement with the security sector is very specific. It's ad hoc. It's not as common as maybe one would think. So I've learned a lot from everyone on this panel, and I'll just finish my last sentence. In terms of that political will, I think that, in my unbiased opinion, I think that humanitarians, aside from conflict-affected, water-deprived populations, we feel that political unwillingness possibly the most, because we are often on the front lines, if you will, of responding to crisis. So,
Thanks. Thank you. Florian. One sentence.
With Swathi's permission, I will from now on use resilience multiplier as a term. I think that is excellent, and because I dislike this red multiplier narrative because it gets us excited but doesn't move us forward. Resilience multiplier moves us forward, takes us comprehensive, and I'm really pleased actually that the political resonance, that understanding that these are political issues, is quite strong on this panel. So I'm relieved on that end.
That's good to hear. General Godard, your one sentence takeaway.
Well, one sentence takeaway is that from our discussion and from the questions raised, the developed world have a lot to learn from the developing world in terms of how water resources are managed during armed conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexandra?
All of what's been said, plus having to think harder about the role of the security sector without securitizing climate, water, peace, and security, where there's a lot of suspicion around over-securitization. Unpacking that was really interesting.
Thank you. And Swathi?
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, I think just how water is deeply political and often ignored in many different contexts, including the developed world, which I think is a point that you raised, and how we need to ensure that we don't forget water in those discussions. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting session. I hope you liked it. I think it was way too little time. We'll complain to the organizers. I think we touched on this complexity, right? And even us here on the panel got sometimes a bit mixed up in the question, is it now about water being at the origin of conflict? Is it water being a threat or a resilience multiplier? Is it about water being affected by war, or is it water actually being used as a weapon? And each of these elements then has its own story on how the different actors, including the security sector, engage or not, what knowledge they need, what knowledge they want in which form, 5 or 240 questions, when can they use it, who can use it, how to do that from the very local all the way up to the international and global level. So I think we really only very much scratched the surface in this session, but I hope you found it interesting nonetheless. I hope you'll continue the discussion over coffee now. All the panelists are here. Please ask questions. I want to thank all the panelists, but I also specifically want to thank Tanya Mishkova, who is the mastermind behind this session. Thanks, Tanya, for... That's good to know. So come back next year. And for now, thanks to everyone.